So what do we measure GDP for? What on earth are we doing? So one of my criticisms of newspapers is they tend to use all these concepts like GDP growth. But newspapers just report them like there's something that's real and something that matters. The real underlying question about GDP is, why on earth do we even bother measuring it? What's it for? What's the point? Why do we care? So in the next couple of slides, we'll talk about reasons why we might care about GDP. Okay. The answer is, economists don't really care about GDP. It's not really an important thing. If you ask the economist, what's the core aim of economics, the economist is not going to tell you to make GDP as big as possible. It's not it. Not it. Economics is not about making money. Economics is about the best use of resources to attain people's goals. That's probably about as broad as you can get. It's saying, how can you achieve the best that you can achieve for yourself? How can you achieve as much happiness or contentment, whatever way we want to say that, or utility? How can we achieve the highest level of happiness for people given the amount of resources that we currently have available to us? In that definition, GDP doesn't enter. Because GDP is not actually the outcome you're interested in. You're actually interested in people being well off. What we'll see, of course, is that actually, on lots of measures, people tend to be better off living in countries with high levels of GDP. So we'll talk about it. So the problem is, we can't really measure happiness. And when we do try to measure happiness, we get all sorts of stupid results. Again, picture yourself walking down Sydney saying, "Are you happy?" to people. You could walk down the street in Sydney. You could go to Athens, Greece. You could go to Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. The weird thing is, you visit any of those places and you ask people how happy they are on a scale between 1 and 10, and everyone tends to say about 8. These are very different places in the planet with lots of different GDPs. And they're all reporting around the same level of happiness. So happiness has nothing to do with GDP. So what do? Well, we're still measuring GDP, and we're still reporting it in the newspaper, and we're still pretending as though it matters. But it's not really because of happiness. So we don't really measure because of happiness. What we're measuring GDP for is that we assume that the kind of lifestyles, the opportunities, the access to things that people have rises when GDP goes up. And I'll show you some charts later that show you that that's definitely the case. People are better off living in better off countries. That might be one way of saying it. So here's this paradox of happiness. Richer people report themselves as happier than poorer people. So you walk down Sydney and you ask people how happy you are, how happy you are. Oh, by the way, how much does your family make a year? And there's a strong correlation there. The people who earn more report higher levels of happiness. The people who earn less walking down the street in Sydney report lower levels of happiness. But what happens? Well, I then go to Port Moresby, or I go to Athens, or I go to Vladivostok in Russia, and I ask people how happy they are and how much they earn. There's still that relationship there. Everyone reports an average of about 7 or 8. But the richer people in Papua New Guinea are happier than the poorer people in Papua New Guinea. But everybody in Australia is 10 times, 20 times richer than anyone in Papua New Guinea. Yet the Australians, with 10, 20 times the wealth, will report themselves as sadder. A poor Australian will report themselves as sadder than a rich Papua New Guinean, even though the Australian is several, quantum leaps better off than the rich Papua New Guinean. So the problem here is that, in fact, what people tend to do is they're humans. So what they do is you ask you how happy you are. You look around, you compare yourself to everyone around you, and you say, I'm better off than that guy, therefore I'm happier. I have a new Range Rover, and he's driving a Daihatsu. I'm happier. I look down the street, and my kids are going to private school, and that couple's kids are going to public school. I'm happier. So what people do is they look around them, and they say, I'm happier because I'm better than those people there, and that person, and that person, and that person. So this is a paradox of happiness. People just look around them. So what that means is if I actually double the wealth of everybody in Australia, no one will be any happier. They'll The poorer people will still be miserable, the richer people will still be happier than average, and everyone will report the same level of average happiness of about 7 or 8. Simply because what you tend to do is you look around yourself. Right? People in Australia don't tend to say, you know, Sierra Leone has a lot of violence, and lots of people in Sierra Leone get butchered in the street. Therefore, I'm better off than someone in Sierra Leone, therefore I'm happier. You don't see anyone say that they're going to vote for Julia Gillard because the Australian economy is doing better than the Russian economy. That's not what people are doing. People tend to say, I'm doing better than that person, therefore I'm happier, therefore I'll vote for Julia Gillard. So again, humans are very hard to measure with this thing because happiness is a very relative concept. And it's relative to the people around you, which makes it even worse. So we can't measure happiness for all these sorts of reasons. So we tend to measure GDP. But GDP is important. Okay, so I'll show you some shots just to try to give you guys some ideas about what differences in GDP means. So AusAid, which is the Department of Australian taxpayers, partly paid for these surveys that I went and ran in Solomon Islands of Vanuatu. Okay, so this is what your beachfront property looks like in Solomon Islands of Vanuatu. And since a lot of these are tiny little island, almost everybody has got a view like that. So how much would that view cost you in Sydney? Yeah. Between $6 and $22 million, right? Depending where you are. Everybody in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu has access to something like that. They just got to wander out, go down the street, they're there. There's your beach. Beaches are really nice too because they're all Pacific beaches, so they're nice white sand. So everyone in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, almost everyone who cares to, would have access to that sort of property, which would cost you $6 to $20 million to buy that sort of acreage with that sort of view in a place like Sydney. So why doesn't everyone move to Solomon Islands? $22 million would buy you a lot of Solomon Islands. Yes, and there's also the problem, you really can't buy land in these sorts of places. But yeah, so it's not just the view and it's not just the room that matters. Okay, so we're talking about places that are just to the northeast of Australia. So most of the people in places like these little islands are subsistence farmers. So they basically have what's called market gardens, meaning they're just little gardens outside the back of your house that you might plant yams, you might put peppers in, or corn, or potatoes. Survival is very easy typically in these sorts of places. Even during calamities, there's almost no level of starvation. There might be very low levels of protein. That's because everyone is eating things like bananas, coconuts, yams, and meat is hard to get to. But again, these are sorts of countries where bananas just drop on the ground and rot. No one can be bothered to go farm them. You don't pick them up. Food is easy to grow. But that's not the only thing we're interested in as humans, right? It's just not access to properties. It's not access to views, and it's not access to food necessarily. There's other sorts of problems in these countries like violence and corruption that make it very hard for people living there.